Testing, 1, 2.
Yes. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to this Spring 23 edition of Digital Delights and Disturbances. This is the lecture series on digital technology in a critical perspective, which is supported by, organized actually by the Communications and Media Studies Department. Hello, everyone. My name is Donatella Della Ratta, and today I'm very happy to start the first lecture of the Digital Delights and Disturbances lecture series with Adi Kunstman, who's sitting here right next to me. And Adi Kunstman is a reader in digital politics at Manchester Metropolitan University, and also the coordinator of the digital pathway for the PhD program, and then leading also the MA program, right? Adi has done a bunch of super interesting work. Actually, I've been knowing Adi's work since the Arab Spring because they have authored something on digital militarism, which was really, really interesting. And at the time, super cutting edge. Nobody was studying digital militarism and forms of violence through selfies or social media in general. So that was really amazing. But Adi's interest, since then have actually grown a lot. And today we're going to talk about digital politics and the politics of disengagement. We're going to talk about data justice. We're going to talk about environment, the consequences of the digital on the environment. So a lot of food for thought for us. So without further hesitation, I leave the floor to Adi. And after the talk, we're going to have the chance of having a Q&A with all together. So your questions are very much welcome. Please, Adi.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, so I will talk, as Donatella said, about digital politics and the politics of disengagement, and I will focus on various aspects of justice. So I'll start by raising something about digital politics more broadly, so that if we think about how the role of digital technologies such as social media, algorithms, the AI in national and international politics should not be underestimated, and it continues to grow and evolve every day. If we just think about the last decade alone, global politics were completely transformed by the rise of social media, data mining, algorithmic information control, fake news, misinformation, cyber warfare, internet shutdowns, biometric surveillance, and the list can go kind of on and on and on. But at the same time, we're seeing a surge in politicized use of everyday digital communication tools, such as social media platforms, apps, smartphones, selfies, by ordinary people in citizen engagement, in protest and everyday resistance. And while all of this is happening, digital politics as a field is rarely explored holistically and interdisciplinary beyond a narrow focus on things such as digital activism or cybersecurity or electronic warfare or internet governance. And so one of the ways to do that differently, more broadly, more holistically, is to ask, what is digital politics? When and how is digital political? How are big and small political events shaped in digital environment? How does the digital reconfigure the political? How has the use of digital tools by political players changed over time? How do citizens understand, experience, and feel about digital politics? And I'll leave those questions here for you to continue meditating on them. And at the heart of these questions and at the heart of my attempt to answer them is a journey into interdisciplinary inquiry, which is conceptual as well as methodological, but on top of all that, and perhaps first and foremost, it's a journey into questions of justice. So my own work on digital stuff, which I can't tell you how many decades I've been doing it, has always been justice-oriented. So for example, in early 2000s, I was looking at how a marginalized community of LGBT migrants can find a place of belonging via the internet, but also how this belonging was dependent on inflicting injustice on others. And then in early 2010s, in the work that Donatella has mentioned, I was studied how social media can become a tool of symbolic political violence in the hands of governments, militaries, and also reactionary citizen activism. And then late 2010s, early 2020s are seeing an unprecedented spread of digital technologies in all spheres of our lives. And that actually began some years before the pandemic, and then increased and solidified in an unprecedented way since 2020. So what we're seeing now is a rapid digitization, which is coming from the assumption that our social life has to be digital, that governance, public services, work, transport, education simply cannot exist without digital technologies. That digitization is both beneficial and inevitable. And I think if you think back to the last 3 years, this is kind of the overall sentiment. So when I look at this all-encompassing digitization, my aim is not to affirm this normalization of the digital. This is what is happening and actually, unfortunately, in a lot of current research on digital technologies, which is asking how are they used, by whom, to what effects, but the digital itself is never questioned. And instead, what I suggest is that we need to denormalize, denaturalize digitality itself. So while I'm looking at it from the perspective of justice, I'm asking, who does it benefit? Who does it harm? Do we need it? And can we do without? And this is really what's going to be guiding me throughout my talk. And this is what Esperanza Miyake, my colleague, and I call digital disengagement. So actually a lot of the talk is based on this book, which is open access online, but I have a hard copy if you want to see the real thing. So we worked on this for years, and we've kind of written some of it together, and some of the chapters we authored separately. So digital disengagement is a term that unravels the assumption that social engagement is always necessarily digital. And it challenges this forced incorporation and engagement of livelihoods, experiences, relations, services, economies, freedoms into compulsory digitality. Digital disengagement is, at the same time, I argue, a matter of political economy, cultural formations, materiality, technology, legal frameworks, and everyday actions. So what Esperanza and I have worked on are questions of digital disengagement, digital refusal, and opt-out, and we've done it for years, and we literally just finished this book. So here it is again. And in the book, we argue that Western neoliberalism, capitalism, and the global economy are crucial for understanding the conditions in which this digitality is normalized and enforced. It's not just something that happens to us. It's not just something that we decided to agree on one day. So digital economy, for example, profits from the exploitative production of digital devices, smartphones, tablets, computers, or the ever-growing communication infrastructure, Wi-Fi, broadband, mobile data, and services such as platforms, apps, and the cloud. Most crucially, we're seeing the rise of digital labor, which within highly digitized society, the generation of profit from digital content, subscription services, and most crucially from data monetization in what Shoshana Zuboff aptly coined surveillance capitalism. At the same time, the neoliberal capitalist culture of life and work in a digital economy often invisibilizes both the labor itself and the architecture of exploitation, be through the practice of play-bar, which is kind of a combination of play and labor, or the rise of the so-called gig economy, which traffics in hopes of flexible employment while brutally degrading working conditions and evading both tax and employment laws in many countries. In this context, digital engagement, and we argue disengagement, becomes necessarily tied to corporate regimes that regulate and control global capitalist economies through an internet-centric logic that capitalizes on data aggregation. And then this, in turn, requires constant participation, because if we hadn't participated, there wouldn't be any data. And constant dependency on digital technologies, while the exploitative nature is often very skillfully hidden. For example, digital capitalism becomes translated into individualized techno practices of entrepreneurialism. The economy of compulsory connectivity presents itself as self-care, aided by digital technologies, and data monetization and profitable surveillance disappear from view when endless agreements and acceptance of terms render datafications as users' own responsibility. So you have to accept terms and conditions. It's your responsibility. So the broader structure completely disappears. On top of all this, we argue that while opportunities to disconnect and opt out are generally shrinking, try to travel without a smartphone, or use a service without an email, or put an application without internet access and without being digitally literate. Not going to happen, right? So while this is a general phenomenon, the impact of this compulsory digitality is not the same for everyone. Understanding that this deep interrelatedness of enforced digitality and social marginality is key. As Siripenya Gangadran poignantly notes, the impact of digital coercion is always uneven, and it tends to reproduce and intensify existing marginalization and injustice. Our analysis is therefore not just about questioning how and why digitality is normalized. Rather, our work, first and foremost, is justice-oriented. And we ask, who does normalized digitality serve? Who is its captive audience? Its unpaid laborer, its depleted resource, its dependent, its victim? Who has the freedom to disengage from the digital, and at what cost? Speaking about justice, we go beyond the questions of individual rights, including those defined, for example, by various legal frameworks such as GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. We're placing digital justice at the center of digital disengagement, and we're thinking about it collectively rather than as something individual. So while remaining attentive to the importance of individual rights to disconnect and opt out, these are really crucial, we argue that individual digital rights alone can offer only a partial and flawed framework in the era of large-scale datafication and automated decision-making. A collective digital justice is imperative when compulsory digitization segments groups and populations and targets marginalized individuals and communities, for example, for surveillance and policing. When it punishes and rewards based on big data analytics, and when it traffics in the collective, accumulated value of digital labor, be it from content production, engagement data, or other forms of behavioral profitization. So because all of this is collective, there's actually very little point of talking only about individual rights. So what I'm going to present now is some examples of what do we have in mind, and because we've written the book together, but we've taken some of the chapters to kind of dig deeper into some of the topics. So I'm going to be talking about 3 of the chapters that I worked on, 3 of the themes. And what I'm going to present here are 3 aspects of digital disengagement as justice, which we explored in the book and which we continue to explore beyond that. And I'll start with the question of social justice. This is probably the longest, just to give you a sense of how the structure is going to go. This is kind of one case study, if you like, or one example that I want to go deeper and then probably rush through a little bit through the rest of it, and hopefully we'll have more time for questions if you want me to elaborate on any of that. So the first one is the growing impossibility of digital refusal or opt-out of algorithmic decision-making and other forms of digitized governance when it comes to management of civil life, in particular of those most vulnerable to or most dependent on the state. So this is one of the chapters that I worked on, and in my work I looked at digitization and automation of government services. I'm sure it's happening here as well. It is happening in the UK very much so. So I looked at the UK, and I begin with a discussion of UK's government so-called digital transformation plan. Very similar to many other countries, it's a move to e-government, and the UK plan included moving all public services and their various application processes such as visa, welfare, council tax payments, and so on, online. It also included communicating with citizens via social media and also, finally, automating as many decision-making processes as possible with the help of AI and algorithms. And we're only going to see more and more of that globally. Now, I'm going to be reading the UK government's idealized version of efficient state services and happily serviced and digitally engaged citizens as it is presented against the grain, and I will contrast the narratives of e-government with the realities of growing violence inflicted by digital policing, digital welfare, and digital immigration management on those most vulnerable to it, and as a result, also those who are most powerless to resist it. And I position my discussion within the broader concern of what it means to be a digital citizen. Not so much around political behavior, such as voting or activism, nor around citizen participation in civic life on the communal, hyperlocal, or national level, which are the more traditional domains of scholarship on digital citizenship, if you look into it. Instead, I focus on how the interaction between the individual and the state in areas such as public services, border management, and policing are mediated by digital platforms, online communication, algorithms, and the AI. In the field of e-governance, e-government, these new developments have been overwhelmingly welcomed, with much of the work, much of current research focusing on the managerial and institutional efficiency, improvement of public services and citizens' trust, and challenges to development and implementation. My own analysis, instead, is deeply critical of the celebratory approach to e-governance, which basically goes, it's fantastic, let's just make it better. So it's critical both because of its solutionist nature, digital technologies as the best and the only solution to any issue that arises, something that we unpack throughout the book extensively, and also because it tends to prioritize efficiency to care and bureaucracy to justice. Instead, I'm informed by the growing body of critical scholarship that attends to the relations between digital governance and the rapid expansion of digital state surveillance on the poor and the racialized, the racial and class violence of digital bureaucracy, and the militarization of digital tools for state xenophobia and racism. So I start with one vignette called The State's New Digital Clothes. In 2012, the UK government introduced a strategy of digital transformation of government and public services. The strategy, which was set out to how the government will become digital by default. I love the wording. I didn't make it up. It's actually, that's how it was called, digital by default. And it was not dissimilar to many other countries that have adopted the e-government model of providing a kind of one-stop services in online platforms, offering electronic and mobile services for the benefit of all, to use the words of United Nations in 2016. The online presence of public services is constantly evolving, so when I started the research, it looked differently to how it looked a year later, to how it looked when we were writing the book. But at the time of when I was wrapping up the research and wrapping up the book, 2020, 2021, it was a series of interlinked pages. It wasn't like one online site. It was a series of different pages where you can walk around like a maze and just come and get endlessly lost. And they were presenting this digital transformation strategy as friendly, citizen-facing, datafied efficiency, streamlined, service-oriented, and empowering. So it's just a preview of the picture. So it was set up in 2013-17 plan and then 17-20 strategic plan. And the idea was that it will be digital by default by 2020. They didn't know that the pandemic was going to hit, but they are pretty much on target. And the policy was centered around the GDS, Government Digital Services. It's worth noting the kind of citizen services recipient that was rendered on the GDS website. So who's going to be using this? A citizen that's not only skilled enough to navigate multiple endless Gov.uk web pages, but also proficient in and comfortable with the idea of using social media for contacting authorities. That probably is something that you may do, even I might do, even though I'm much older, and probably kind of the older we go in generation, this idea is just insane of doing that. And that, of course, is replacing a possibility of talking to a real person, say, over the phone. So the question is, how can we reach state power when its decision-making bodies begin to speak the informal language of platform sociality? And I think, Donatella, when you mentioned my work on selfies, kind of in the service of militarism, for me, there's actually a longer legacy of what do we do when kind of big, powerful bodies such as states or militaries use the everyday language of a social media user, pretending to be your ordinary dude with a selfie, because it's not an ordinary person. So there is something very interesting going on in terms of how power is communicated and concealed. So we see something very similar here. So decisions are massive about welfare, life and death, visas, movement, policing, punishment, but they speak the language of platform sociality. So if you look at the Government Digital Services blog, it uses the vernacular style of social media connectivity. Most noticeable when they end their posts by saying, be a friend, follow us, engage with our content. In the age of widespread social media on the one hand and corporate platform communication on the other, such social mediatization of the state is increasingly blurring the lines between the communal, the corporate, and the political. Furthermore, the use of vernacular grammar such as being a friend, which was initially made popular by Facebook, or a follower, which is used across platforms, by government services that hold the authority of making decisions fundamental to one's livelihood and freedom, is a powerful, and I argue powerfully masqueraded tool of state rule. At a time when citizen social media behavior is increasingly subjected to state surveillance and monitoring and interrogation by, for example, police or welfare services, one only needs to be reminded that although the platform's friendship or liking of one content is still optional, the possibility of defriending the government online is a dangerous illusion. At the same time, social media surveillance and platform data mining are actually openly described on GDS as more suitable tools to support and improve public outreach. So they even have a social media playbook of how to do this, kind of a set of guidance of how social media can and should be used in public services. And there, if you look at it, the everydayness of surveillance, such as monitoring conversations, cross-referencing, analyzing multiple data, tracking links, drawing on corporate platform analytics, is both laid bare and trivialized, wrapped into the marketing style language of understanding your audiences, reaching to your audiences, improving communication. So this is from the, I think, this and this one. Yeah, this one's probably the most interesting. So it's kind of, it is from the social media playbook, which is developed for everyone to use. So this is one side of it, of reach out to your audiences so you can monitor them. Finally, government digital services operates through what only can be described using Sarah Ahmed's terms as non-performative performance of transparency. Non-performativity, if you're familiar with Sarah Ahmed's work, refers to statements. So you probably know performativity, right? Judith Butler stuff on kind of words that create what they name or do what they utter, what they pronounce. Non-performativity refers to statements that do not do what they say. So a performative statement is I pronounce you husband and wife. By saying this, somebody becomes husband and wife. Non-performative statements don't do what they say. So Sarah Ahmed's work was in the context of anti-racist statements by the institutions that do not change the institutional racism. They just say they do. And here I refer to non-performative transparency, where information appears to be present while the process of decision-making remains concealed. So on one hand, the sites present an extensive information on technical design standards and principles of digital services, which is very important to stakeholders or technical professionals, but honestly is beyond the comprehension and often interest of most ordinary service users. So there is a lot about the kind of language, the kind of coding, the kind of fonts, including accessibility. So it's really important, excessive. On the other hand, for the users, those who will be using governmental services, the backstage of the service itself is explicitly invisibilized through the rationale of making the service easy and accessible. And this is a quote. And it says that Gov.uk is built on the principle that you shouldn't need to know how the government works to use government services. So all the hard work is happening at the back, and you just kind of sit and relax. Except, I mean, when I read this and I suggest, I'll take a second to drink some water and you take a second to read it, because I find it outstandingly creepy. When the government tells you, you don't need to know how the decisions are made. So the concealment isn't actually harmless. The technical and procedural black boxing of public services processes, and in particular the mechanics of decision-making, can make and does make the system impenetrable and its algorithmic decision impossible to challenge. And that, of course, has dire human consequences. So that was the state's new close. And now my second vignette, which is related, the other side of it, is the state's new digital weapons. So I'm asking here, what then is the human cost of e-government for those on the receiving end of digitization by default? Distress, despair, loss of income, poverty, starvation, imprisonment, death. Who are the captive subjects? Who are its dependent victims? One of the key areas in which digitization of public services has developed rapidly in the last few years is welfare provision, state support. The rapid process of digitization of welfare in the UK and elsewhere globally often works in tandem with welfare reforms, which rarely benefit those who depend on them. In the UK, the reform resulted in a substantial reduction of the amount received by many claimants of welfare. In a very, very briefly, in that case, it combined health support, health benefits, child benefits, housing benefits into kind of one-stop system of points that you can get of how much benefits you can get, and actually everybody lost the amount they were getting. The UK reform didn't merely change the calculation of which type of support individuals are entitled to, but transformed how welfare is accessed, making the claim process harder while making the denial or underpayment easier. And as one of the UK journalists called it, automating poverty and punishing the poor. And as of late 2010s, most of the welfare applications need to be completed online, despite many of the recipients not being digitally literate, lacking access to a suitable device, or even unable to write. So, and this is absolutely massive. Beyond issues of digital accessibility, the application process itself is absolutely incredibly complicated and obscured, making it practically impossible to understand the process or challenge the decision, which is fundamental to one's livelihood, finance, and survival. In digitizing welfare services, the algorithmic decision-making process is black-boxed not only from recipients, but from helpline staff. So if somebody calls the helpline, they don't have access to how and why a calculation was made. All they can do is read what they see on the screen, which is the final outcome. And this lack of transparency, coupled with this, and with plentiful evidence of numerous errors, glitches in the system, so where a glitch in the system or wrongly ticked box or an extra zero or less zeros, or even a case of misplaced, lost, or mismanaged data results in loss of welfare support, homelessness, starvation, and even death. A welfare system that is algorithmically driven and digital by default, then, is the new face of state cruelty, dressed into the language of efficient public services. Similar cruelty is at the core of digitization of policing, which I could have talked about for hours if we had more time, but basically where digital identification technologies, such as we have mobile fingerprint units, biometric extensively used, automatic number plate recognition, facial recognition, mining of social media content of groups deemed of particular interest, which are usually racialized groups, phone location data, all of them are connected to multiple databases and they're coupled with predictive analytics. And the latter in turn is racially biased with a devastatingly high level of over-policing and over-convicting of Black and other communities of color in the UK. The expansion of racially biased policing into digital domains creates what Patrick Williams described as short and long-term data harms of both individuals and communities of color, linking long history of racial and class violence to discrimination and oppression, and to what Ruha Benjamin recently described carceral technoscience. And the same process also can be seen in border control and management of visa application, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Again, if we had extra couple of hours, I would have given you more details. And that leads us to the question of social justice and data justice. So data justice is the heart here of how biased data is created. But I also want to kind of turn to a more mundane example of data justice or data injustice. So that will be my second example of the second theme. So of kind of second example of impossibility of opting out. So it's an impossibility of opting out of everyday datafication, which we could see, of course, throughout e-government. But another fascinating and troubling example is what we call appization. So the use of apps. I presume all of you have smartphones, all of you have apps on them. And with the widespread of smartphones, we're increasingly reliant on apps that are either preloaded or can be downloaded, sometimes voluntary, casually, sometimes professionally, mandatory, to manage various areas of our consumer work, political, personal life, travel, and whatnot. So we all use them, and we use them more and more because there is an app for everything now. And the invisible yet detrimental byproduct of appization is infringement on privacy, data monetization, and long-term digital profiling. These are very rarely understood by the users who are lured by the speed and convenience of various services, and sometimes forced to use the apps required by managers, teachers, travel agents, and various service providers. And I suspect that in a few years, there will be a lot of things that we will not be able to do without an app. So appization is usually presented as an unquestionably positive process, devoid of dangers and beneficial to all. Such a celebratory framing both conceals and supports the app's data economy of surveillance capitalism that relies on users' willing but often unknowing participation and the continuous personal contribution of our data. So thinking about data justice, I'm looking at the phenomenon of appization through the perspective of digital disengagement. So rather than addressing the way apps turn data into profits through surveillance capitalism, dressed as smart and effective service, I turn my attention to how the apps navigate and often block or limit the possibility of opting out of everyday datafication. So in some of the work that I've done together with Esperanza Miyake and another colleague of ours, Sam Martin, we have carried out a research about health apps. And we approach them, so we're following Deborah Lupton, who talked about apps as sociocultural artifacts. So we approached them as artifacts, and we looked at them as sociocultural data traps. And elaborate and sophisticated in their technologies of incorporation and engagement and invitation, but incredibly scarce in social affordances and technical mechanisms of letting their data subjects go or allowing them to remove themselves from the database. So in simplified words, very, very sophisticated in bringing somebody in, but not releasing after that. We've developed a range of methodological tools to analyze apps from the point of view of data justice. So, and I'll try to return to it in a second, but for now my question is, how should we understand, conceptualize, and challenge this current landscape that we're living in of sociocultural data traps and the shrinking space of data opt-out? So for example, when you say if you want to deactivate an app, it's nearly impossible to know whether you can also take your data with you. Data has already been collected. So as a first step, I argue individual app users need to equip themselves with socio-political and technical tools for understanding, mapping, and monitoring the datafied operation of the apps they use. Secondly, and crucially, one must also reframe opting out itself as a matter of data justice and not just data rights. So GDPR, for example, talks a lot about data rights, which can be applied to apps. So what are the rights of a particular user? But we are suggesting we need to turn to data justice. So data justice is placed at the center of considering the entire data ecology and data economy, rather than merely addressing individual practices of one user in relation to one app. And here I'm aligning the idea of digital disengagement with the emerging body of scholarship on data justice. So for example, Lynette Taylor formulates data justice as something that should include the freedom not to use particular technologies, and in particular, the freedom not to become part of a commercial database as a byproduct of development intervention. So she talks about it specifically in the case of various global so-called development initiatives, but I argue that it applies everywhere. So Taylor's call is particularly relevant today, where the large-scale rapid initiatives of digital contact tracing, for example, if you may remember contact tracing apps during the pandemic, which happened really quickly and it happened globally, and it created a substantial commercial gain for both the firms that were involved in developing the apps in different countries, but also the large platforms whose decentralized technology is being used. In order to create a space for both individual rights to refuse to be part of a database and a more systemic collective refuse of what we call biopolitical categorization that is enabled through big data practices, we need to acknowledge, again, that focusing on individual data rights, including the right to opt out, is not and will not be enough. To challenge the structural nature of apps' data traps, we need to move away from the question of data commodification more broadly and look where it happens in health and education and travel. And this doesn't mean refusing the use of digital technologies or public community services. We're not saying let's throw away the phones and go live in the woods. But it is about moving to decouple, for example, equal and just service provision from a compulsory dependency on commercialized digital communication. And when digital tools are truly and urgently needed, and they might outweigh individual concerns about privacy, such as the case of a global pandemic where contact tracing apps were introduced, they must be adopted in a thoughtful and transparent way, instead of, as we could see, merely assuming they will work or are indeed the best solution. Digitization that is attentive not only to individual rights but collective data justice must, I argue, purposefully strive to avoid exclusionary and discriminatory data harms on one hand and profit-driven data grabs on the other. So this is as far as social justice and data justice, and I want to move somewhere else entirely to wrap up the talk, and I want to talk about environmental justice. So this is something that is even less discussed within the field of digital media studies than the question of opting out. So the final aspect is the relation between digital disengagement, refusal, and the environment. So a lot of scholars have actually pointed out that digital communication technologies, they don't just exist on a cloud. They're not immaterial, even though we call them, we kind of think about them as a material, and most of the metaphors that we use are A, immaterial, and B, bizarrely relate to nature. So if we talk about data farms, even though there are no green grass and cows in data farms, we talk about saving on a cloud, even though it's not up in the sky, it's on a server, and so on. But it's throughout the history of internet communication, it's always been, was surfing first, many, many decades ago, and there were a couple of others in between. So we kind of don't think about them in a material way, but if we actually move out of communication studies, there's a wealth of research about how communication technologies inflict significant damage on both humans and the environment. And the impacts vary considerably, and they include, for example, ever-growing extraction of rare minerals needed to produce digital devices, which, by the way, will run out one day. the toxicity of the production of the mining and production process itself. E-waste left behind after their very short lives made disposable by design. At this point, by the way, when I teach my own students, I ask them, how often do you change your phones? I'm not going to do it here, but mainly I think because of the recording, but I ask them, and we kind of map a line of the longest and the shortest. So the shortest, somebody says 3 months, and we're excluding things like, theft or lost phones. So how often do you replace your phone by choice? So they said several months because why? Because a new model is available and it's way cooler and everybody wants it, so you kind of want it too. The average was 2 years. Why 2 years? Because contract. Again, I don't know how things work here in the UK. Most smartphones are on the contract, and the contract gives you a new device every 2 years. Some people hold onto their phones for longer, but we kind of start unpacking, do we really need to change our phones so quickly, but also what happens to our phones when we send them away to die. So there is a tremendous and kind of incrementally growing amount of e-waste left behind these really short lives. But also, in addition to all of this, there is a rapidly increasing energy demand, generally of internet communication. The more intense it is, the more energy demands, the higher resolution and the kind of more data we're streaming, for example, more energy demands. But also there are particularly data hungry and energy hungry things to do, such as AI, deep machine learning, or Bitcoin mining. And then we've got carbon and heat emissions of internet traffic and of data farms, all of which is needed to sustain every click, every website, every tweet, every selfie, every big data database, every smart network, and so on. So these activities have profound impact on land, water, landscape, and atmosphere, and on people and communities. But despite actually staggering levels of evidence, mostly outside of media studies, and some small but existing body of work within media studies, these damages are often overlooked, paradoxically precisely when digital technologies are placed at the heart of green imaginaries. Popular political scientific narratives are centered around environmental protection, sustainability, and various other eco-values to which digital technologies, it is argued, are going to be central. So one of the things that motivated me specifically to write this book about digital disengagement is the question of, A, the realization that we do need to digitally disengage for environmental reasons, to reduce, refuse, reuse, recycle as it goes, and kind of other environmentally committed logic with application to the digital. But also, starting from that point, I was seeking any evidence of, I kept asking, is there environmentally driven digital disengagement? When we started our research, and the more talks we were giving in the process, most examples of digital disengagement coming from the audience were, yes, I too decided to deactivate my Facebook. Or yes, I went on a digital detox and didn't use my phone for a whole week or whole weekend or a whole holiday. There was practically no evidence of kind of environmentally driven reasons, so I kept looking for them. What's fascinating is I found that environmentally driven digital disengagement becomes a trap. So, for example, in the popular discourse of disconnection, the idea of digital detox, very often technologies are juxtaposed to nature. But this idea of green disconnection, is it actually embedded in environmental justice? Sorry, this was the e-waste image, and mining and production. So, to kind of start answering this question, I did a Google search, Google image search for digital detox. Just type the words, and my screen just turned green. So this is just a couple of screen grabs from what I could see on the screen. So it basically splashes of green, pictures of flowers, trees, grass, and scenic photographs of serene landscapes. Now this is, I call it algorithmically curated collection, right? Because not only that it's what Google offers you, every time you click on an image, it offers you to see image like that, similar images. You can see some examples here of kind of how they're grouped. So it's algorithmic curation. So as I scrolled more and more through this algorithmically curated collection of slogan-wrapped visuals, each preview leading to further clusters of related or similar images, my screen was awash in green icons or digitally orchestrated nature. The latter, by the way, appears untouched by technology, while in reality it's scrupulously photoshopped to perfection. The green color returns over and over again in an echo chamber that renders digital disengagement as synonymous with connecting to nature. But is it? Or rather, what exactly is envisioned when this connection is presented as an escape to nature? So I started looking at the sites behind the images. So some of the websites listed on the search led to digital detox holiday packages or major booking platforms such as TripAdvisor. Other links led to smaller businesses specializing specifically in retreats in remote locations where one can take a proper break from technology, that's a quote, a break which can instead be filled with, another quote, yoga, good food, refreshing nature, and downtime. There's kind of like a catalog. These and other similar sites are not solely dedicated to digital detox and disconnection. Rather, they offer an extensive menu of choices to trips and destinations. So for example, the retreat website has categories for adventure, yoga, foodie, sunshine, and digital detox is one of them. So nature here is a resource to be consumed. And of course, as such, it's also a brand, mobilized to promote tourism and hospitality businesses as long as there is a demand for them. In the process of branding and marketing, nature becomes an abstract idea. It can be anything and anywhere. It's offered as one of several commodities, together with fruit, vegetables, chocolate, yoga, and downtime. But rarely as an actual place, with actual landscapes, often ravaged by tourist industry and gentrification, which I'm sure you're familiar with here. There are places devoid of living and non-living beings, unless the place itself needs to be explicitly described as non-digital in a kind of colonial imaginary of remote wilderness without technology. Either way, there is very little nature actually included in the digital detox idea of escaping to nature. And once we move away from holiday packages to other websites located via the image search, we find even fewer traces of natural environments behind the pictures that led us to these sites in the first place. Many of the pages do not refer to nature at all, with a rare mention of going on a walk as one of the many things you can do instead of browsing on social media. Some of them have information about mental health, information overload, digital addiction, some tips on how to set up and follow disengagement habits. They describe experience of disconnecting, sometimes even present apps to manage detox. So Too Much Digital here is an app to help you. And all of this is in line with this consumer trap of never-ending digitality, which is solve the problem of too much technology with more technology. Often the only reference to nature outdoors is the image, which led us to the website in the first place. So if we look at the multitude of web pages dedicated to digital detox, the greenness of this connection is both overwhelming and phantom. Deceivingly, nature is repeatedly visualized as the choice where to escape from technology and what to do instead of engaging with it. But it's a touristy choice, embedded in a colonial and capitalist logic of objectification and commodification, where nature is a status symbol, luxury to be consumed while seeking wellness, rather than a space to live in, or treasure, or a space to be protected. And this commodified nature is cleansed from any human and non-human inhabitants, and it's also cleansed from any signs of labor involved in sustaining and serving these sides of nature, from social and environmental damage, often brought by the globalized wellness industry, and from the material and immaterial impact of the digital infrastructure itself, which is needed to organize, promote, and manage these retreats. Of course, to offer a retreat away from technology, one needs an extensive web and social media presence, as well as other digital means of communication. So the reference to nature is an empty gesture. It's merely a symbolic resource in the visual attention economy, which in turn is tied to the economy of tourism and leisure on one hand, and digital economy on the other. Ironically, but highly surprisingly, this semiotic extractivism of digital detox imaginary really resembles the extractivist nature of tourism itself, where material resources and cultural practices are consumed, commodified, and appropriated, often emptying their communities from natural resources as well as political power. The blindness to environmental impacts of digital technologies and the reluctance to consider toxic materialities of the digital characterizes not only this corporate world, but also the academic research. Blindness to the material harms of digital technologies still prevails in most media studies today. In particular, in English language, white and Western-centered mainstream, which doesn't tend to examine digital communications' complicity in environmental degradation, nor does it tend to account for the materiality of the digital and its human toll when discussing culture and communication, unless it's specifically focused on the environment or digital labor. And despite decades of critical voices within feminist, post-colonial, diasporic, and so-called global South scholars Mainstream digital communication studies have largely enjoyed and continue to enjoy the luxury of ignoring the deeply material consequences of the digital system. Such consequences mostly impact those in the global south and the disenfranchised, racialized, and colonized communities in the global north. So there is something about out of sight, out of conceptual mind. There is a number of exceptions. In the last decade, a number of books were published, such as Carbon Capitalism and Communication, Sustainable Media, and a few others. Most recent book by Bene Brevini is AI Good for the Planet, situating digital communication within a multi-scalar resource economy of extraction, production, distribution, consumption, representation, wastage, and repurposing. And it's a quote from one of the books. And yet, even within this critical scholarship lies a paradox. For example, despite its environmental commitment to its editors to the global and the global scope of readers, sustainable media is ultimately driven by a belief in the power of media as a means to come to terms with and help ameliorate the ecological harms produced by industrial processes. Similarly, contributors to Carbon Capitalism and Communication foreground the power of communication to tell the untold backstory of the media industry, as well as to address climate change and confront climate denial. Awareness rather than refusal, adjustment rather than abolition. These are so far the main organizing principles in the emerging debates about the environment responsibility and digital communication. So where does it place digital disengagement? I'm kind of wrapping up with that. Looking at the array of discourses on environmental sustainability and the digital in a range of disciplines, my critical questions therefore remain whether and how questions of digital disengagement can enter the conversation about environmental accountability and so-called eco-ethics. How and when can we evoke the drive to refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle in relation to digital communication? There is a number of interesting initiatives currently emerging in design, such as sustainable web design or phone production. You may have heard of Fairphone. Interestingly, though, they're called for being digital differently rather than being less digital. This is something to think about. And then the pandemic hit, and digitization increased rapidly everywhere, super fast, without thinking, because emergency. The immediacies of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis often acted as a tool of obfuscating the racial and global nature of environmental injustice. It's crucial to remember that it's high-income countries that are the lead culprits of digitization's environmental toll. More streaming, much more intense data economy. So the question of environmentally oriented digital disengagement is therefore first and foremost a geopolitical one. It's not about blocking access to digital tools and technologies for those on the disenfranchised sides of the digital divide, which is the first question that's usually being asked. Rather, it's about the responsibility of the privileged and the over-digitally saturated. It's the first world of so-called global north high-income countries that must act to reduce the harms of digital and other overconsumption. For example, by turning to, there are beautiful terms, digital sobriety or lean ICT, technology design and use that minimizes energy consumption, as one example. Digital disengagement embedded in environmental justice that is also racial justice will only be possible if we turn away not only from extractivist world of digital solutionism, but also from individualized, Western-centered and whitewashed notions of safety and wellness as they circulate in the economy of digital detoxes. So digital disengagement, I argue, must become a form of collective turn against the harms of the digital world we're living in. The call for radical digital citizenship, to use Emmanuel McGregor's words, and radical digital environmental responsibility is now more urgent than ever. Do you have a few more minutes to wrap up? Good. Okay, so these were my kind of vignette examples, storytelling, angles to think about. So as a wrap up to everything, I want to return to the question of justice. Oh, we never left it, but I want to kind of bring it back to the table. And I want to talk about opt-out as a path towards collective justice. So social, political, economic, legal, and cultural structures of compulsory digitality, from digital by default policies to the social pressures to participate in online sociality, to digitization of nature, may only ever allow partial opt-out. That's really important to remember. I don't think we would be able to completely disengage, nor may necessarily want to. These partial opt-outs can stretch elastically into entire cultures of disconnectivity or disconnection as lifestyle politics and develop whole markets of disconnective commodities, as Tara Crapy calls them. Now, what about systemic exits? In the book, we have argued that one of the few ways in which we can attempt to systemically denaturalize the digital is by centralizing collective and centering collective social and digital justice, and I would add environmental justice, and developing alternatives from below. As for instance, the example of digital self-defense activism in the context of systemic bias of discriminatory tech and racialized surveillance, where communities that are most harmed by over-policing or state surveillance organized from bottom up to learn about the tools that harm them and to learn how to resist them. So in the book, we've shown that while supporting digital freedom and safety, the logic of self-defense, of community-based self-defense, is radically different to the logic of cybersecurity. They might sound the same. Cybersecurity works from above, self-defense works from below, but also cybersecurity is embedded in hierarchical militarized logic, whereas self-defense works from above, prioritizing non-hierarchical, non-militarized solidarity. In recent years, we're seeing more and more examples of such bottom-up organizing, offering opt-out as a form of protest by those most disempowered, rather than as a form of commodity for the privileged, which is where most current examples of digital disengagement are ending up. Many of these emerge in the sphere of gig work. For example, delivery couriers or Uber drivers, where oppression is built into and operates through constant connectivity. Indeed, many gig workers are using the idea of logging out as a form of resistance. It is a tool that's equally powerful and difficult to execute collectively because gig workers work in structural isolation. When they work for an algorithm, it's nearly impossible to meet other drivers and unionize. Some find creative ways around the system's digital cruelty, for example, by placing food orders via the Deliveroo app or ordering rides via Uber. This is what couriers and drivers did in London when they were organizing, and thus allowing gig workers to meet up with others. So they were ordering from each other's services, and that's how they could talk and meet. And during, for example, the Deliveroo workers' strike in London in 2016, which was supported by Uber drivers, log out was the protesters' actual chant on their spontaneous picket lines. Logging out can be more than just a chant. Many Uber drivers, for example, try to log out to await a surge in price and can even do so collectively to then artificially inflate fees by creating a systemic lack of drivers, which then automatically signals higher demand and higher prices. Uber in turn defines such logouts as fraud in its community guidelines and automatically punishes anyone logging out during shifts, whether it's in protest or if you want to take a toilet break. Defining logging out as a violation of contract and the basis for dismissal makes logging out a worker's right and places it at the center of fight for justice in the platform economy. Uber's robo-firing, an algorithmic process which doesn't disclose which data is being collected and used by the platform about its workers, was collectively challenged by drivers from the UK and the Netherlands. This is one of the several cases where employment law and data protection laws such as GDPR were deployed to push back against workplace digitality and digital oppression. Tactical refusal, selective engagement, and defection are indeed becoming key tools of the so-called overworked and underpaid. Equally important, and maybe even more important, is the organized resistance by those who are developing, building, and managing these digital tools of oppression. There is one absolutely beautiful example of such resistance, is the solidarity of US-based tech workers who published a Never Again pledge in the early days of Donald Trump's administration. They wrote, "We, the undersigned, are employees of tech organizations and companies based in the United States. We're engineers, designers, business executives, and others whose jobs include managing or processing data about people. We're choosing to stand in solidarity with Muslim Americans, immigrants, and all people whose lives and livelihoods are threatened by the incoming administration's proposed data collection policies. We refuse to build a database of people based on their constitutionally protected religious beliefs. We refuse to facilitate mass deportations of people the government believes to be undesirable." It goes on and on, there is more. Further details on their pledge include the refusal to participate in the creation of databases of identifying information for the United States government to target individuals based on race, religion, or national origin. Advocacy to minimize the collection and retention of data that would facilitate ethnic or religious targeting and scale back existing attempts to do so. Seeking legal processes and support for the vulnerable. and when unable to prevent unethical practices, speak out and whistleblowing. Actions such as these are key to understanding the responsibilities of those who are privileged and empowered by the digital economy and are complicit in its operation. While the possibilities of disengagement and refusal are rapidly shrinking for those most vulnerable to digital violence, a refusal to build and sustain tools of digital oppression is more important than ever. Furthermore, a pledge by tech activists also reminds us that while digital oppression persists, refusal and disconnection, even when done collectively, is not enough. It is within this context that we need to understand, embrace, and support activist policy, legal, and academic initiatives that address digital injustice structurally and collectively by a range of frameworks of data sovereignty, data justice, digital abolition. There is a number of work in this area that is emerging, weaving together everyday struggles, multi-layered analysis, culture, and economy, and I'm literally finishing with a few because this is what I want to leave you with. So, for example, in the context of indigenous sovereignty and settler colonialism in North America and Australia and Oceania, the use of data emerges as one key site of struggle against informational imperialism and digital colonialism, leading to projects such as Policy Framework for Indigenous Data Sovereignty or Indigenous Data Sovereignty Software. And some of these initiatives focus on technology development and use. For example, the principle of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and care, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. Other initiatives address the architecture of colonial policymaking and education within which the indigenous data sovereignty emerges, and develop principles of indigenous data sovereignty as a way of centering indigenous knowledge in communities, using data in good rather than harmful ways. Unlike the notion of sovereignty, other work has emerged that centers the idea of abolition. For instance, in his book, Goodbye, I Slave, A Manifesto for Digital Abolition, Jack Key focuses on digital abolition in Asia and globally as a proposed move against Apple's exploitative conditions of labor, which are akin to slavery. Consisting of workers' resistance, alternative gadget production such as Fairphone, digital education, and program disconnection time, digital abolition, as he envisions, is simultaneously resisting the murderously degrading working conditions of iPhone assembly lines in China, the environmental cost of mining in Congo, hazardous e-waste processing in Bangladesh, and mindless global consumerism, compulsory connectivity, and digital dependency. Drawing on the actual history and legacy of slavery in the US rather than on slavery as a metaphor, Ruha Benjamin powerfully lays out abolitionist tools for what she calls the New Jim Code, a digital data code incarnation of centuries-long US anti-blackness. Benjamin's digital abolitionism is about centering Black lives against systemic racism and anti-blackness in the US and globally, building solidarities for digital defense, avoidance, and dismantlement of racist tech. It draws on grassroots research while also supporting resistance and empowerment through algorithmic accountability and electronic scrutiny. At the same time, digital abolitionism for Benjamin is about reclaiming digital tools for social justice and for Black lives, including justice-oriented, emancipatory approach to data production, analysis, and public engagement as part of broader movement for Black lives. The initiatives for digital sovereignty on one hand and digital abolitionism on the other strive to protect and empower those most vulnerable to the violences of the digital, be those the material conditions of digital production and work, cultural or environmental theft, or algorithmic racialization. Crucially, they also make us particularly attentive to geopolitical, historical, and contextual specificities of struggles for racial justice against both individualized framework for digital rights and universal notion of digital freedoms, which ignore the interrelatedness of the digital with other forms of oppression and injustice. Thank you.
Yeah, I have some water. Thank you very much for such a long journey into this, not just one topic, but so many interesting, inspiring issues that you have touched upon. So I have some breath, I have some water. Before leaving, asking the floor if they want to ask any question, I want to ask you a couple of things, just picking up some of the things that you have mentioned during the talk. So, for example, you started off by mentioning that there is actually a category of people who can disengage, who can be digitally disengaged, but then you didn't really touch upon who are these people. And immediately when you mentioned this, I had a click because I remember seeing an article back in 2019, so before the pandemic started, from the New York Times. The title was really interesting. It said something like, human touch or human contact is the new luxury. And the article touched upon the new category of people, namely the rich, who were the only ones who had the privilege of opting out, because they didn't need any social media, they didn't need to get a job through social media, they didn't need anything, you know, that they couldn't buy elsewhere with their money, right? They didn't need leverage also through social media. And also, for example, when it comes to, let me just mention healthcare, which in the US now is increasingly a victim of this digitization and automatization. And so you might have seen, you know, these digital pets, the avatars, that for people who do not have enough money to buy a good healthcare package, they actually go there and connect with this digital pet, who are most likely located somewhere in the Philippines, because in the end they are not bots, they are real people animating the pets. So this is to say, for example, the article argued that this category of people who doesn't care about this innovation is in fact the rich. Because the rich, they can actually call a real doctor, right? So the article did argue that the only category of people who can actually opt out from the digital are the rich. So the 1%, if we want to quote, you know, the Wall Street protests. So this is my first question, you know, so do you agree with this? Is this like really the holy category that can opt out from the digital? Whereas the middle class, actually, the article argued that the middle class is increasingly a victim of this digitization and automatization. And the second question is about the Global South, which you did mention also in your talk. Ironically, very ironically speaking, you know, most of the consequences in terms of land, expropriation of land or damage to the environment, or also enslaving people digitally, do happen in the Global South, right? However, my little experience of the Global South, I am a media ethnographer focusing on the Arab world, which I guess is it's not entirely like the only place which we will situate in the Global South, but yet it's a piece of the Global South. And yet, when I was every time I go to any Arabic-speaking country, and I'm going to give you just an example, Lebanon, the entire population, I think we are talking about a few millions of people, is on Facebook, is on social media, and they told me always, opt-out is a very neo-colonialist kind of politics, because you guys from Europe and the United States have the privilege of disconnecting, we don't. Because for us, for example, we lack a public sphere. So where do we go if we want to connect with people? In many places, there is the issue of like secret police who's watching after people, not in order to prevent like meetings that can end up doing revolutions, blah, blah, blah. And for many of these people, it's a matter of survival. So I want to raise this issue because it looks like a big contradiction. While here we are advocating, and I had a lot of friends who used to this movement, delete Facebook, delete whatever, hashtag delete whatever. And my friends from the Global South, like Arab friends, they used to say this is a very elitist, white, colonial attitude because we don't have that privilege. Yeah, so these are my first remarks.
Thank you. I mean, I couldn't agree more, and I think you've answered most of it yourself really beautifully. So to start with the first one, with digital disengagement as a kind of form of commodity and capital and new luxury and new gold, absolutely. Because indeed, I mean, there are several examples to that. There was one where there was one really fascinating interview with high-tech executives and lead IT specialists in the Silicon Valley whose children don't play on iPads. That was when the iPad educational apps, it was before the pandemic. So the pandemic kind of put a big lid on because everybody had to, schools were closed and kind of whatever gadget you can give your children. But before that, there was a big kind of rise of interest in the educational potential of apps and tablets and mobile devices. So their children don't use iPads. They barely use any electronics. And at the heart of that interview was really powerful and poignant question. You know, you are the creators, you are the advocates of, and you say this is not good for your children, so how could it be good for other children, for children of others? So absolutely, by all means, it is this particular form of non-digital access to non-digital services and lifestyle is absolutely a new form of luxury, where for reasons of cost, for reasons of underfunded systems of social care, I really loved your example with the digital dog, but there are many, many others. So one of the reasons people, for example, turn to various digital health apps is because there either isn't a doctor or the doctor is not affordable. And we can, of course, talk about what kind of quality of medical care can be provided by basically algorithmic bot catalog. So absolutely. So whenever, and first of all, I fully agree with you, but I also want to add with this, whenever we bemoan the loss of human touch when we talk about the digital stuff and automation, we need to remember that the access to this human touch varies by social privilege. And I think for us, when we started, we worked on this for nearly 7 years, and this is something that really hit us and surprised us when we began with working on digital disengagement. We conceived it as this kind of very, I don't want to say revolutionary necessarily, but very kind of justice-oriented political project of disengaging for reasons of, and we started doing it at the same time as the interest in disconnection was picking up. And the examples that we were seeing were examples of privileged disconnection, various forms of detox. So there is absolutely, but also I think what is worth looking at is how the pandemic has changed it. So there is one of the, I think one of my favorite chapters in the book, which actually was written by Spranta, which is on labor and on how when more privileged middle class or / white collar workers had to be on the screen all the time, all of a sudden, a lot of institutional care emerged to support people with Zoom fatigue, and they need to be in a comfortable chair, and they need to stretch, and health benefits, whereas those who were doing call centers on the computer all the time until then were never afforded such care. So I want to kind of diversify and complexify and look for various contexts where access to the digital or access to the ability to refuse the digital is absolutely connected to social privilege and social position. But this is also where it ends, because I think one of the crucial things from our book and from your examples is the question of context. So there isn't, so two contexts are not the same. What is absolute lifeline for someone? Something changed to the sound. Something changed? No? It kind of went to different registers. So it did. So what is absolute lifeline for some is a prison for someone else. So, and therefore, I completely see how the request to disconnect can come as a form of white and Western privilege for someone who's just acquiring this type of connection. But this also doesn't mean that everywhere in the global South it will look the same. Absolutely, and I mean, to me, this is all about questions of who, when, and how can disconnect, under which conditions. So similarly in our own, first of all, people who work in the gig economy, and you can tell them, disconnect to empower and to avoid Zoom fatigue and screen fatigue and to free your life. But if you work as a courier with an app, you can't disconnect. Not only that, a lot of couriers and gig workers have several devices and multiple apps working for multiple companies at the same time. So I think the question of politics and justice and context in a way is more important than do we or can we disconnect, and it's about who is afforded the luxury. But I completely agree with your statement that this is emerging as a new form of luxury. And I think we could also see that split during the pandemic as well, of kind of who was able to avoid that and who couldn't. In a similar way of who could afford to be confined in their own home and Zoom fatigued. This is kind of another discussion, especially during the early days and during lockdown, and people moaned and complained everywhere, versus those who were the essential workers or the couriers who couldn't afford to be stuck at home and Zoom fatigued and watching too many Netflix movies because they basically kept their life going. So I think keeping these questions at the center of the discussion, which sadly I see within the field of digital social studies and digital media studies, they often disappear. So we kind of tend to speak in generalized terms. I think this is absolutely crucial. So yeah, but thank you for your two additions.
Just try to add a point on this because I wonder, since you are you speak Hebrew and Russian, so I'm wondering because these are places that usually we don't hear anything like when it comes to debates about the digital. It's very Western-centric. So I wonder if being a Hebrew speaker, Russian speaker, the kind of discussions that we are having about the digital opt-out, you can feel that it's happening. Well, Russia maybe these days, it's not really. But I mean, what about those contexts?
We actually had, a number of years ago, we actually had a joint project with a team of researchers in Russia about digital disengagement. And we inspired, I was working with several colleagues there who were doing grassroots-led, community-led spring summer school on internet studies. They were part of a club of Russian club of internet enthusiasts. And one of the themes in one of the years was digital disconnection. And it was both very relevant, and one of the discussions we had is academic colonialism and how concepts travel. Because on one hand we collaborated, and I was completely obsessed with the concept, and I was trying to see would that work and how would that work. And largest part of the team that I was collaborating with was also Western educated, or kind of spent some of the time in Western academia, but also struggled with how do you translate a concept that doesn't translate into Russian. And that doesn't mean that people don't disconnect, but it kind of leads us to the question of how theory travels and dominates. What is happening there now, I don't know, but to me the question of the state's very strong hold on citizens digitally, I think today's Russia is as strong as, probably as strong as ever, because of the war in the Ukraine, and any kind of, however tiny, fleeting opposition to the war, if it's half whispered on social media, right? I mean, anything else, or if you protest on the street, this is also criminalized. So the question, I think it's less the question of disconnecting completely and more a question of very complex and sophisticated digital literacy, where you evade suffocating digital state power. But I also agree with you that one thing that would be really interesting to do is to look at how this works globally. And even though it may look like I'm shooting in my own, or cutting my own tree that I'm sitting on, or shooting in my own foot, I would start by maybe putting this concept aside and asking, how do these things work elsewhere, rather than saying, let's do digital disconnection work in different contexts, because in some it is relevant and in some it isn't. And in some questions of data justice or data grubbing or extractive economies is really relevant, but may not necessarily fall under the framework of disconnection studies.
Thank you very much, Adi. I don't want to monopolize you, so let me open the floor to questions. Anyone? Don't be shy. Oh, thank you.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, I was wondering, this isn't actually fully fleshed out, but it was completely silent. I was wondering, in terms of opting out yet again, how and if you think that opting out contrasts maybe digital environmental justice in the sense of people showing climate disaster or e-waste like overflow and whatnot from their own perspective and sharing that globally, and does opting out kind of take away from that or not?
Thank you. I mean, I really appreciate this question, because it's one of the biggest conundrums / traps / I wish I had an answer, because, and this is kind of my both admiration but also critique of the several books that I mentioned, where they absolutely raise generally the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, and also more specifically the role of digital communication technologies in making it worse, but also saying we need those communication technologies to communicate this. if I'm hearing your question correctly, how do we, basically if we're saying if we disconnect them, we won't be able to talk about it. I wish I had an answer. I actually don't know, but I think it's a serious question in a sense that kind of my answer would be, can we, in this conversation about climate disasters, global environmental injustice, can digital environmental harms, can they also be part of the conversation? And sometimes they are, but very often they are not. Can our own accountability for the cost of the tools that we're using to communicate be also part of the conversation? Because I think when it is, then things start changing. So it's not, let's not talk about it. It's, can we talk about it differently? And actually, I mean, I didn't have more time to give you more examples, but there are some, unfortunately not enough, but some initiatives of digital media done differently. So one really beautiful example, not unfortunately in the case of environmental activism, but in the case of streaming, there is an incredible Canadian scholar, Laura Marks, who works with a team of filmmakers on one hand and kind of IT specialist engineers on the other, looking at the environmental impact of streaming. And kind of, so in a nutshell, the higher the resolution, the bigger the file, the more the demand, right? So rather than saying, well, should we not watch films? Shall we go away with cinema as art completely? What they developed instead is the small file film aesthetics. And they held a small file film festival. The quality, both viewing and artistic, of small file films isn't diminished at all. But it's a very explicit commitment to make it as minimally taxing on the environment as possible. And I'm really inspired by these examples of, okay, we do need to communicate this. So we do need to use some form of communication. How can we do it differently? So Fairphone would be another, that's kind of, as in terms of, as far as devices go. So we are still connected, we're still using them, but we're refusing the extractive and horrific digital economy of smartphones, and we're using smartphones that are fair produced, kind of like fair trade, and kind of like fair trade, which made a massive shift. Sadly, fair phones are really expensive. So, I mean, in addition to these questions, because I work in questions of social justice, so when I talk to my students, I think it was last year, and I teach in the university where a lot of our students are first generation and working class and low income. And so the question is, could you afford 400 or 500, I think it's 450 now for Fairphone, is a big one, right? Which is not to say necessarily, not to discard this as a privileged solution that we can't afford. How can we do activism that is centered on this form of justice as well so that this becomes possible? I hope this answers, given that I don't have an.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. I know that digital media has, in some cases, harmed more than helped the political scene, especially in our generation and the generation a little bit older than us. But I'm wondering, and I want to know your opinion on if an opt-out will kind of halt at least my generation's, I guess, drive to be politically active. And I guess this goes for a lot of aspects of the opt-out, because in some ways I'm like, oh, maybe press and broadcast news will become, I guess, in again in our generation, but then there are also, I just wonder if it will revert back to what it was pre-digital media in the opt-out, or if a lot of inspiration that has come from digital media will be lost.
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. And I only wish I could answer it. And I think you said something really important about how digital media harmed your generation, but also kind of what are its possibilities. And I'm taking this really seriously, because how do we continue using tools which we know not are harmful but can be harmful? I think once we phrase them as can be harmful, we can maybe start by thinking, how can we use them in a way that are not harmful, right? So if we think, I mean, I don't know, which kind of harms did you have in mind when you say they harmed your generation politically?
Maybe like with fake news and like at least, yeah, sharing false information and maybe gaining an opinion politically that you might not have gained before from maybe super left or super right-winged theorists.
So kind of being algorithmically driven information. I mean, I wonder whether, for example, digital disengagement or opt-out, which isn't about not communicating at all, but for example, challenging the power of algorithms to determine what we see, would be an alternative. For example, so could there be a news feed that is structured the way you would want it to be rather than determined by the algorithm? And can we actually, like, I think it could be a question of, can we imagine things differently? Which isn't, digital disengagement isn't about, let's just go to pen and paper completely. We can go sometimes. I think zines can actually be amazing. I now started running workshops on the questions of the environment and pen and paper. Let's just draw some stuff. But it doesn't mean no internet, no phones at all. It means what kind of structures of normalized, completely common actions that we use can be challenged and reframed. And I think this relies to, on one hand, kind of information shaping in the shape of fake news, but also another one with the rise of, so there is the scrolling, but there is also with the rise of, I think sometimes it's called bullying when it's kind of younger and usually in relation to school children, but there's actually a lot of bullying kind of all the way, all ages up. So various forms of interpersonal violence and nastiness, which doesn't stop. I think it just become more visible among school children. So how do we communicate digitally? How do we organize digitally? How can we be politically differently? So I would take this as an inspiration to think, what can we opt out of and what can we build instead? And if I knew what that was, I don't, but I think, and one of the reasons I really hugely appreciated your question is when we start by understanding what the harms are, it's already halfway to thinking, okay, if these are the harms, what can be built instead to dismantle those harms or repair those harms?
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe less of a question, more of a comment. Just thinking about the Fairphone, because I've had one for many years. And, you know, I like the Fairphone. I don't want to, like, elevate it as, like, the ultimate solution and the best thing, because I know, you know, one criticism is that it's still like a consumer solution to the broader problem. And, you know, the critique of, what is it, consumer consciousness or whatever. But anyhow, I still prefer it over a regular phone. But one of the things I find interesting about the Fairphone that I appreciate is they seem to embrace a certain kind of, I don't know if radical is the right word, but transparency, where they put themselves up to audit, third party, and the audits tell you, well, the Fairphone is not really 100% sustainable, and they report that to the, and they say, we're not 100% sustainable. And I think that's amazing. And the other thing that because I go to their blog periodically and read about what they're saying, there was a really interesting discussion about mining, because they have to use mines, they have to get minerals for their phones, and they were talking about the difference between, I can't remember the right term, like boutique mines, I guess, which would be like family miners versus corporate miners, and saying, yeah, you know, the corporate miners are really bad, but the problem with the boutique farm miners is that they're completely unregulated, and in many ways they have more environmental destruction because no one's, you know, there's no standards. And just being transparent about thinking through these problems, I thought was amazing, and saying, like, there is no good solution. There's not, neither one is better than the other, but at least having an opportunity to see how the sausage is made, so to speak, to use a bad cliche, but that's something that I appreciate, even if it's not a perfect solution.
Totally. Just to add, I mean, we could have talked for hours about Fairphone and about, you know, kind of back to the question of accessibility. and that it's expensive. I mean, if you want to change policy, it could be so simple to basically give everyone a tiny loan to buy, because once you buy it, it lasts, because you can repair and repair and repair, right? So these things are simple. It's actually, you know, it's easy. So we kind of have bigger questions of bigger economic power, where why do we still have only one company that making a repairable phone, only one, whereas most other companies go to less and less and less sustainable. So so Apple, I think you couldn't change remove and change the battery ever. I'm not an Apple user, so I'm not sure. I think that's right. With Android, for example, Samsung, which is considered one of the best, used to have a replaceable battery. I used to have my old Samsung I can't tell you how many years old, because once the battery runs out, you replace the battery and then it charges as good as new. And newer generations, for years now, you just can't, right? So there is, and why do we still have only one rather than 10 phones where you can take them apart and replace everything that needs replacing or fixing and continue using it? So it's not, this is just one example of the broader capitalist economic system where we don't live by reduce, reuse, repair, and refuse where needed. I just I guess I want to, go with this vision, and I do want to push for how do we rethink the digital, where we continue refusing and repairing and reusing depending on the context. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. The transparency is beautiful, and we don't see that kind of, what we see in other companies is greenwashing and sustainability washing instead of transparency, and it's completely sickening, because now everyone talks sustainability. It's the kind of new whatever, so you can see it. Apple, sure thing, here's our sustainability policy. If you read it, if you kind of take it as given. So this is maybe where we can start thinking of how things can change.
Other questions? I actually wonder, what's your take on NFTs? Because these days a lot of artists are crazy about, they think it's the new thing, but very few talk about the environmental consequences of NFTs.
I don't know enough to give a proper lecture, or my favorite 10-minute response to a short question, but in my university we also have a School of Art, where we recently had a really beautiful panel by artists from the School of Art who talked both about LFT, how important, but also brought this up that actually environmental tolls of LFT is really, really substantial. And again, my worry is, given the language of sustainability in the arts is the language of policy and funders, we will see a lot of sustainability washing. I don't know whether we're going to see enough challenges around LFTs. I guess, my initial reaction when it just became a conversation was, again, so the kind of digital disengagement for me is not let's go live in the woods. It's a change in perspective and a change in a starting point. So rather than saying I am never going to enter any building, I want to live in open fields, I say if we do build buildings, if we do enter one, we need to start with the way out. Should we need one? And we also need to start with the question, do we need it? So when something new, yet another new digital stuff emerges, and we see them now every couple of months, rather than saying yay and let's go for it and glorify and celebrate and put money into innovation, for example, we need to start by asking, do we need this? Do we really need this? What kind of harms it might inflict? Now we're fully aware and we decided that we are going to do it. Where is the way out for those who want to, or should we come to realization that actually it's more harming than not? And this is about perspective. So I would love to see a perspective like that on LFT, and then maybe have a conversation rather than saying no, never, or yes, amazing. But it does concern me very much.
Thank you very much, Adi. I think you left us also with a wonderful expression. I remember from your talk, digital sobriety. Let's all think about digital sobriety. I think this is a great starting point. I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank everybody who's here. Special thanks also to Professor Micali, Com Department, Media Lab, Roberto, Brian, Staff Maintenance, Maham Insha, our intern, Lucia Conte, my research assistant, and all our students, our press officer, Leonida. And well, anyway, enjoy the evening, and please join us next Thursday, because we're going to have a second talk for digital delights and disturbances with an artist, actually, who does biohacking of technology and DIY, Giulia Tomasello, 6:30 p.m. here, Aula Magna, John Cabot University. Thank you.
And thank you for your questions.
Congratulations for talking like